We're heading into the football season. Yeah, Mike's like, oh yeah. We're counting down the days. Heading into the football season, and whether it's college football, pro football, even high school football. I love the Mighty Falcons. I love watching football. One of the things that makes football kind of entertaining, though, there's always the side stuff going on, right? Among which are the mascots. Mascots are fascinating, and I've always been, just kind of interested in why teams are named the way they're named. There's a history behind every mascot. Sometimes it's for something going on in the location. A lot of the teams, whether it's pro or college, it has to do with animals and animals that are fierce and can really inflict some harm. But there's also the warrior and the warfare imagery with these mascots. And even in the professional ranks, you think about the Raiders, the Buccaneers, the Chargers. You've got Patriots, Vikings. And in the college ranks, you got the Trojans and the Spartans. But this idea of warfare. And, one of the things that has been done over the past 100 or 150 years that we've had football is comparing football to war. And I suppose the violence of the game kind of lends itself to this idea of football and war. But every once in a while, you'll see some athlete invoke war or warfare language in the locker room after the game, and they start hearing from the vets, right? You don't know what war is. It's interesting that the warfare imagery around, things like football, and of course this is also true, we've got those same names in baseball and basketball and hockey and what have you, but games imitating warfare, and at the end of the day, we have to take a step back and say these are just games. What we're talking about today is very, very real. It's not a game. In fact, there's imagery used to portray what's going on in warfare, and it becomes very easy for us to sit here and look at this imagery and think, this is just a way of thinking about how our personal struggles. When somebody cuts me off on the interstate, that's warfare, right? Yeah. This is an image. This is imagery, but this isn't fake. This is real. The struggle is real. The warfare is real. And war itself is real. Yeah, you think about, again, the opening minutes of Saving Private Ryan, if you've seen that movie. Any documentary that's documenting just exactly what happened in World War I. You're immediately confronted with the fact that war is real. The warfare we talk about today is just as real, if not more real than that. This warfare in Ephesians 6 is not only real, but it's personal. And so it's not to be taken lightly. There's a lot at stake. We want to see some of that today. So today we're going to continue our series, Made for More, talking about how we engage and bring Jesus into every area of our life, where we live, where we work, where we play, and where we learn. And again, we're talking about the armor of God. We started this discussion last week. And again, here's how Paul describes this armor. We're just going to run through this briefly and come back to it. So here's this armor that he's talking about, the armor of God. Truth, which is a belt around your waist. Righteousness, which is armor on your chest, or some sort of chest armor. Readiness of the gospel of peace, which is on the feet. Faith is the shield, salvation is the helmet, and the word of God is the sword. So he's describing this armor of God. If the church is going to fill all corners of society with Jesus, then it has to put on this armor. But before we get to that, before we get to this, it's very easy for us, and we do this time and again with this particular passage, we go running to this and we start teasing out what truth means, what righteousness means, what readiness means in faith, and then what are we doing with the waist, what are we doing with the chest? We're not going to do that today, per se. But before we even get to this, what Paul is talking about, we have to understand what's going on in the backdrop and how they would have heard it and understood it in their congregation as he's writing to them in that very first century. And he's pulling into the story of warfare that begins at the very beginning of our Bibles. The story of our parents, Adam and Eve, in the garden. And again, we reference this often because this is where everything goes wrong, right? God creates this perfect world, and he places Adam and Eve in this perfect garden, and pretty soon they're deciding they want to run the whole show. God promises this as he is talking to them in the aftermath of their rebellion. Here's what he says. I will put hostility between you and the woman. He's talking to the serpent here, the serpent who was the one who kind of orchestrated this to begin with. But he says, I will put hostility between you and the woman. Hostility. God is saying there's going to be war. There's going to be struggle. There's going to be antagonism, hostility. And from this point forward, because of our parents' rebellion and our rebellion, there is hostility. And of course, as we begin to read through these pages, and of course, we read through these pages, and then we read the history books, and we know that history is full of war. People at each other's throats because of what happened there in the garden. But throughout history, God continues to make the promise. Part of this promise in this hostility bit is that he's also promising a seed. He's promising a champion, a Messiah that's going to come and fix the sin problem. He's going to come and fix the war problem. And so as we see the story of all of humanity unfolding in these pages, throughout these stories, God is continuing to promise that there's coming this warrior, this champion, the one who's going to fix it all and do away with all the war, all the pain, all the suffering. And he does it time and time again throughout history. God is promising that this warrior is going to come and make everything right. And so we get to Isaiah. We read this moments ago. We get to the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet thousands of years after Adam and Eve are on the scene. Hundreds and hundreds of years after Moses is on the scene. Again, Israel's in trouble. And God, again, is talking about this promise, this warrior who will come and make everything right. Listen to Isaiah. I've narrowed it down, and I've put everything in the book of Isaiah down into a short paragraph. This is how Isaiah describes this divine warrior that is coming. This is what he says. He will strike the land with a scepter from his mouth. Righteousness will be a belt around his hips. Faithfulness will be a belt around his waist. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of that herald who proclaims peace, who brings good news of good things, who proclaims salvation. He put righteousness as body armor and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and he wrapped himself in zeal as in a cloak. He made my words like a sharp sword. That's his description of this divine warrior, this champion who's coming. The divine warrior who comes to fight for his people is coming with, again, let's look at what he just says. He's coming with a scepter from his mouth, righteousness as a belt, faithfulness as a belt, righteousness as a breastplate, salvation as a helmet, gospel of peace on the feet, and his words are a sword. That's Isaiah. Hundreds of years before Jesus shows up, and certainly hundreds of years before Paul is now writing to a congregation. He's talking about this divine warrior, this champion that is coming. And this is what he will be wearing. His righteousness, his salvation, his peace, his good news. Everything that God has promised his people. This warrior is wearing. Everything he's promised to give his people. This warrior is wearing. Righteousness, faithfulness, salvation, good news. There's also vengeance in his armor. The divine warrior is going to carry out vengeance on his enemies. So Jesus comes. Jesus is this divine warrior. Jesus is this divine warrior wearing all these things, and he goes to the cross against his enemies. And he defeats his enemies using all of this armor. The scepter from his mouth. Righteousness as a belt. Faithfulness as a belt. All of this he's wearing as he defeats Satan on the cross. And then as John is writing the book of Revelation, he's also given a picture of the crucified Christ riding a white horse. Here's how John describes, again, this divine warrior. Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True. And with justice he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a fiery flame. Many crowns were on his head. He had his name written that no one knows except himself. He wore a robe dipped in blood. His name is called the Word of God. The armies that were in heaven followed him on white horses wearing pure white linen. A sharp sword came from his mouth so that he might strike the nations with it. He will rule them with an iron rod. He will also trample the winepress of the fierce anger of God the Almighty. And he has a name written on his robe and on his thigh, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That's Jesus. That's John describing Jesus. And that's not just about what's going to happen in the future. He's also describing that Jesus who has come and conquered his enemies at the cross and in the past. So the first thing we need to see as we come, before we even get into this armor of God in Ephesians, we have to understand and we have to see that Jesus already wore this armor. That Jesus has already conquered the enemy. In fact, Paul says this already. This letter that we're reading from in Ephesians 1, he says, you've put everything under your feet. All things that have been given to you. You are now at the right hand of the Father. So Jesus has conquered all of his enemies. It's already done. So the first thing that we need to see as we come into this is that Jesus has already done all of this as the divine warrior. He's already worn the armor. This armor, then, first and foremost, it's not about us. It's not about us. We like to think so because we tend to read these things and extract these things from their context. So if we take Ephesians 6, 10 through 20, and we just slap it on the wall, pretty soon we start reading those things and we start thinking, hey, that's me. That's us. This is about who I am, and this is about what I am going to do. And that's not how Paul is presenting it. Paul doesn't just grab the picture of a Roman soldier and say, hey, okay, you guys go be like this. He's pulling from the Old Testament. He's pulling from Isaiah. This is years before. This is something that's ancient. This is beyond the Roman soldier. And trust me, when I was growing up in Sunday school, and they were teaching Ephesians 6 and telling us to put on the whole armor of God, and it was really, really all about us, we had the picture of the Roman soldier. And Paul is not really drawing a picture of the Roman soldier here. He's drawing a picture of the divine warrior that Isaiah was talking about in the Old Testament, centuries before. So while the Roman soldier would have been something that Paul and his audience knew, Paul's reaching back for something bigger and greater. So Paul says this, as we get into the text, take up the full armor of God so that you may be able to resist in the evil day, and having prepared everything to take your stand. So he says, take up or put on the full armor of God. By the way, there's that idea of full again. Jesus is filling all things. That's Ephesians 1. He's the fullness of the Father. Ephesians 3. He's filling all things using the church. That's Ephesians 4. Now we're talking about the full armor. A church that is filling every corner and every part of society with Jesus needs a full armor. So the first thing we need to see is this is Jesus' armor. The armor of God is the armor of Christ. This is a gift. It is something that is given to us. So when he says put on the full armor of God, and then he begins describing and listing those things that we're supposed to put on. And, oh, by the way, these things that we're putting on, he's describing, these have already been worn by the divine warrior. We're putting on Christ's armor, an armor that he has already worn, an armor that he has already used to defeat the enemy, he gives to us. He gives to us. The armor's a gift from the one who has won using that very same armor. You know, one of the cool things that happens at the end of football games, sometimes the cameras are still on, and you get to see what happens after the game is over, and you see all the players congregating around. And the players are, again, if you watch the cameras of what's going on, you'll see a lot of the players exchanging jerseys. It's a gift. And they're exchanging jerseys because it's really a cool thing to have something that has been worn in the battle. If you've ever been to a historical museum, you've seen the armors, right? You've seen the uniforms that have been worn by soldiers. Sometimes they got bullet holes and wound holes in them as well, right? Already won. Jesus gives us his armor that he has already used to defeat the enemy, and we are wearing it in the armor of Jesus. Jesus gives us the uniform that he wore, and the enemy has already been conquered. Now, last week we mentioned the fact that this idea that we're to be strong, we're to receive Jesus' strength, is also true of this armor. This idea of being strong, again, being passive, allow Jesus to give you his strength. Now, the armor is not ours either. The strength is not ours, the armor is not ours. The strength is Jesus, the armor has already been worn by Jesus. The second thing we can say about this armor that Paul describes, not only is it the armor that Jesus has already worn, this armor is exclusively defensive. Here are the pieces that the armor, the pieces that we're supposed to put on. Belt, body armor or the chest plate, sandals, shield, helmet, and a sword. The only thing in that list that even comes remotely close to being an offensive weapon is that sword. But you put it back with all the other things that have been said in this passage, and it immediately becomes obvious even the sword is a defensive weapon in this instance. This is defensive. These are defensive pieces. Paul doesn't mention armaments. He doesn't mention arrows. He mentions arrows, but The arrows are the enemies. They're not ours. The fiery darts are the things being thrown at us. He doesn't mention javelins. He doesn't mention things, again, that you use, chariots, horses, whatever, that make you on the move. Everything here is defensive. You know, growing up, went to baseball games, and again, more warfare imagery, even in baseball. Yeah, right, charge. There's none of that here. Paul doesn't say charge. He doesn't say attack. He says stand. Resist. And as you're standing and as you're resisting, here's the armor that Christ has already used, and all this armor that you're being given by Christ is defensive. Again, going back to this idea that we're not in attack mode. We're not in the charge mode. I mean, what's the first thing that we want to do when we get accused wrongly of something? Right? Talking about real warfare. Real warfare happens in the heat of the moment, in the heat of the week. Something happens, something goes wrong, and what do we want to do? Charge. We want to charge. We want to attack. Stand. Resist. Here's your armor. Here's your armor against an enemy that has already been defeated. The warfare is real. The struggle is real. The heat is real. The temptations are real. The suffering is real. It's all real. And we're given an armor from Jesus himself that he used to already conquer all of those enemies. And here's the last thing that we're going to say about all of this. Here's the content of that body armor. Here's the content. It's the gospel. Truth, righteousness, gospel of peace, faith, salvation, and the word of God. And you take all of those words and you begin to see that all of this is the gospel. Even truth. Truth, the way Paul uses it, the way John uses it, the way the New Testament writers use it. Truth is all about the gospel. He's not talking about law. He's not talking about God's commands. He's talking about the gospel. We wage war against the enemy, standing and resisting with the gospel. With the gospel. The very same gospel with which we fill all things. When the enemy comes, we use that very same gospel. Who Jesus is, what he's done for us, what he's given us in his life, death, and resurrection. Forgiveness, grace, mercy, peace, love. We use that to conquer the enemy. We are filling every area of life with Jesus using the gospel. And so the armor we put on is the gospel itself. There's nowhere in any of this paragraph, there's nothing in this passage to suggest that God's commands are to be used in warfare. We do not use the law. The law cannot be used to accomplish those kinds of purposes. In fact, it's the enemy, it's the evil one using God's commands in very twisted ways against us. But the only way to handle all of that is with the gospel. With Jesus and the objective reality of our salvation. You know, doing battle with the evil one has absolutely zero to do with morality or behavior. And yet you see this all over the place when it comes to how Christians engage in the public arena. It's all about morality, but not here. Not with Paul. He's not talking about morality or behavior. He's talking about the gospel. And that's what we wage. That's how we defend. That's how we quench those fiery darts of the devil. In the Bible, the law is never a weapon against the evil one. It's only the gospel. In fact, it's the gospel Jesus used to conquer the enemy, the cross itself. So, standing for truth, we hear that a lot. That's also a rally cry. Standing for truth here in Ephesians simply means standing with the gospel, standing for the gospel, standing for forgiveness, standing for salvation, standing for grace, standing for mercy, standing for gentleness, standing for God's unconditional love. All of these things that are part and parcel to our gospel. That's how we stand and resist, filling every corner with Jesus. The evil one is always confronted with the gospel. Filling every corner of society with Jesus is not about morality campaigns. It's about bringing the gospel into every corner of our lives, where we work, where we learn, where we play, where we live. Living lives of forgiveness and peace and grace, paying grace forward. That's how the fiery darts of the wicked one are quenched. And the divine warrior is the one who is actually fighting for us. You see, again, in the heat of the moment, when things are going bad and we feel those fiery darts coming, we have to remind ourselves again and again and again that Jesus has already been here and done that and done it successfully on our behalf. Jesus has conquered the enemy. And so we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to cower into some back corner. We can be confident. We can be confident even if we're wrong about something. Even if we don't do it quite right. We can be confident that Jesus has us because Jesus has already conquered the enemy. That doesn't mean the enemy isn't real. It doesn't mean that there still is a warfare. All it means is that for the enemy, this is a losing proposition. The enemy can never take your soul. The enemy can never take Jesus away from you. And that's what Paul's saying here. We put on Jesus because Jesus is all we have against the fiery darts of the devil. So we stand and we resist using an armor that Jesus already wore, where we live, where we work, where we play, and where we learn.